Well, good morning. Good to see you. Welcome to Bear Creek Community Church. It's always kind of weird on these Sundays, right? Where like a lot of our people are together worshiping somewhere else. You know, men's retreat weekend, women's retreat weekend, youth retreat weekend. But but here we are. We get to worship God together, and I'm just so glad that we can be here and take our attention, turn it vertically, and continue just seeking to be people with our feet pointed toward Jesus. You guys know the legend of Desert Pete? Kingston Trio wrote a song called Desert Pete back in the 60s. But Desert Pete is a legend story about a place in the Amargosa Desert. And let me read to you the legend of Desert Pete. In the remote part of the Amargosa Desert in California, a tumble-down shack stood next to an old water pump. Wired to the handle of the pump was an old baking powder can with a note inside it. The note read, "This pump is all right as of June 1932. I put a new sucker washer into it, and it ought to last 5 years. But the washer dries out, and the pump has got to be primed. Under the white rock, I buried a bottle of water out of the sun, cork end up. There's enough water in it to prime the pump, but not if you drink some first. Pour about 1/4 and let her soak to wet the leather, then pour in the rest medium fast and pump like crazy. You'll get water. The well has never run dry. Have faith. When you get watered up, fill the bottle and put it back like you found it for the next feller. Signed, Desert Pete. P.S. Don't go drinking the water first. Prime the pump with it, and you'll get all you can hold." You've heard it before, the story of Desert Pete. You're in the desert. You're dying of thirst. You come across Desert Pete's note and his bottle of water, and what do? I mean, what would you do? Would you drink it? What you had there, or would you trust Pete, and dump it down the thing? Like, it's gone, maybe. But if you believe him and he's right, then you're going to have all the water you could have. Like, how would you know he's trustworthy? What would you do in that situation? And I want us to keep in mind the legend and the story of Desert Pete as we move into this section of our sermon series this morning. Because as you know, or maybe you don't know, let me tell you if you don't know, we're doing a series right now we're called Storyline, From Paradise Lost to Paradise Restored, which we're looking at the whole story of the Bible and God's commitment to people to draw them back to himself, to redeem and restore his good world that was broken by sin. And so we've been moving through it. This is week number 4. We started out with creation in Genesis 1 and 2 and God's intent for it. Then we had the fall and sin being introduced to the world and the sin pattern of human beings, seeing something, determining that it's good, and taking it, determining good and evil on their own terms, and everything goes badly because of that. The badness and wickedness of humans scaled so badly that God washed everything clean with the flood and started over with Noah and his family. And then we today get to this guy known as Abraham, or also as Abram. And so since the flood has happened, human beings have been scattered around the world. New languages have started. It continues to be a broken world. The curse of sin is still remaining on people and on the land. And yet, in the midst of this, there's a glimmer of hope. Remember a couple weeks ago when we looked at Genesis 3, after the ground was cursed and human beings were expelled from the garden for sinning, God made a promise that the seed or the offspring of the woman would rise up and would crush the head of the serpent, the evil one. And so there's this glimmer of hope where you're longing for God to undo the curse that sin brought into the world a long time ago. And when we read through Genesis, we get to the end of chapter 11, and we meet a guy named Terah, and he's got some kids, and one of those kids is a guy named Abram, who is an important person in the story of God, that God chose this person. And he's from a place called Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram has a wife named Sarai, who we're told is barren. Remember, one of the signs of the curse was that childbirth was going to become much more difficult for people. And Abram's wife, Sarai, is someone who's experiencing that element of broken creation. And it says that in the end of chapter 11, that Terah and his kids, including Abram and Sarai, left Ur of the Chaldeans and went on their way to Canaan and stopped in a place called Haran, which is up like in Turkey right now. So here's what happened after that. So this family has moved from Ur up to Haran, and they've settled there. And here's what God says to Abram. All of a sudden, God speaks to this individual, Abram. It says, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went, as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Sometimes the author of Genesis just lays it out quickly. Like, here's what happened, boom, boom, boom. And that's what's going on here. And this is a very key individual in the story of the Scriptures. Abram, later we're going to see his name is changed to Abraham. And this guy Abram, because of God's choosing, puts a new calling on his life. We're not told much ahead of time what Abram's understanding of who Yahweh was, who God was. What we do know is that Abram worshipped other gods. We're told that in Joshua. In he probably worshipped the moon as well as all these other gods. And he'd moved to this new place, and all of a sudden God speaks to him. We're not sure how this theophany took place, but he spoke clearly to him and said, hey, leave your country, leave your people, your kin group, and leave your father's household. And then go to where I'm going to go. And he says, I'll make you a great nation. Like we said, there's very little we know about him. Other than that, he responded to this calling from God. He says, go, I'll bless you. And so he leaves his inheritance, his gods, his family, everything, to go start this new thing. And we're told earlier that Sarai was barren. And so already the mark of the curse is landing on Abram and his family because he doesn't have offspring, which is a big deal in the ancient world. And they've already traveled a long way from Ur to Haran, several hundred miles, most likely. And so they're up there, and they're hanging out. They're finally getting settled, and God says, I want you to go. And why did God choose Abram? We're not really sure, because if you have read the Genesis narrative, he's not exactly like a stand-up guy. You know, he does have some moments that are pretty admirable, like he's courageous. He's been selfless in a lot of ways, and he trusts God, but also like he lies on multiple occasions. He sexually exploits and abuses a woman, an immigrant. He makes some bad choices along the way, but God chooses him, and he gives him this new calling. He says, go. I'll bless you. You'll be a blessing. I'll bless the world through you. And he leaves everything for the promise of something greater. You can see the connection to Desert Pete, right? That Abram is given this calling to go. He says, I want you to leave what you know. I want you to leave your father's household, leave your inheritance, leave what you have, and I've got something better for you. I'll bless you. I'll curse those who curse you. I will make you a great nation. And so Abram does what? He pours out the water bottle and starts pumping like crazy. And the Lord blesses that. So we have this new calling on Abram. He leaves. And then we have Abram going to a new home, to the land I will show you. Now Abram, 75 years old, he's a well-traveled individual. He's gotten around a long ways. And I mean, obviously traveling by foot in a caravan, months at a time, walking carefully. Each week, if you notice on this series, we choose some sort of icon. And this week we chose these footprints because Abram travels a lot. And I told Carol, I was like, it's kind of funny. It looks like he's hopping, in these footprints. And she goes, no, he's old. So he's just shuffling along. I'm like, okay, all right. That makes sense to me, So he's shuffling along all this way, and all of a sudden he goes from way up north in Haran down to the land of Canaan. Now sometimes we hear about these places, we're like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like if I said to you, last weekend I went from the Ape Caves up to Poo Poo Point and then finished up at Deception Pass. How many of you know those places? You can picture in your mind where those places are. Here's a funny thing. Poo Poo Point. You know how Melissa, I got to give her props for this, has renamed like our children's rooms. The nursery for the babies is Mount Si, and in each room is a different mountain. The changing station in Mount Si is Poo Poo Point. That's funny. Way to go, Melissa. Anyway, but if I were to say I went to those places, because most of you are Washingtonians, you can track with that. You know where that is. Now, if I called my brother who lives in Ohio and I told him that same thing, he'd be like, what? I don't know what you're talking about. So sometimes we hear about these places and they all seem like they're, close together, but it's actually a big distance. I listen to this podcast regularly called the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and this guy named Matt Whitman, who I just like learning from, created this map. And what he did is he took a Google Earth image of the United States of America, and he overlaid the ancient Near East on it. So you can just have an idea of, can you see it? Does it make sense? It might be hard to see. This thing is so cool. It's got a green laser pointer, but it doesn't work on the screen, so I can't point to it. So yeah, but you have to. But if you see there, you have the ancient Near East or the Middle East and Europe kind of put over the United States, and some of those things, like you can see, like Jerusalem, where Jesus was killed, is kind of like an East Kansas City, like out that direction. And so when Paul went to Rome, he went as far as Rome is up there in Leavenworth, maybe, So it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. I like this tool because I can think about it where things are in the United States or in Washington. And so Abram, though, was down here, like Knoxville, Tennessee, okay? So there. And then he went all the way up to southern Minnesota, like Rochester, Minnesota. That's where Haran was. And then Canaan then was another 500 miles down back to Kansas City. Kansas City to Tulsa, kind of that region is the land of Canaan. So he's getting around as an old dude, My parents walk 8 miles a day, and they're in their 70s, so it can be done, but he's traveling an awful lot. But when you look at this map, do you remember in Genesis 1 and 2, we had the threefold holy place of Eden, where we had the dry land, and then we had Eden, and then we had the garden that the human beings were placed in. They were sent out of the garden when sin came into the world. Do you remember which direction they were sent? They were sent east, okay? So the exile takes place, and people are exiled from the garden east, and here God is bringing Abram back from where? From the east, This is God being committed to his problem of undoing the problems that sin has made, and he's bringing them back. And up to this point in the book of Genesis, if you've been reading it or following along, whenever there's land and people settling, what is happening is people are constantly being scattered and displaced from their land. They're either being exiled or scattered or wiped away from where they live. They're being displaced. All of a sudden, we have a new pattern in Genesis. Instead of people being taken from a place or scattered somewhere, we have God settling Abram in a place. And land becomes very, very important throughout the Scriptures. And here we have this great reversal of exile, and God is starting to call his people back to where they're supposed to be. I just think that's really fascinating when you think about the geography of it. But sin disrupts God's design and his plan, and he's working to restore it. And like we said, land is really important, the land that God promises his people. So he has a new home, and then he also has a new purpose. He has a new purpose. He says to Abram, he says, look, I will bless you, and he says, and I will bless people through you, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. That for Abram, it wasn't just about God saying, you know what, I like people, but I'm just going to choose this one, and I'm going to be really nice to him and forget everybody else. But no, Abram is more than just a recipient of God's blessing. He's actually a channel for God's blessing. And God blesses him with the intent of blessing the entire world. And we see that happen through Jesus, through the offspring, the line of Jesus. But ultimately, God wants his people to bless the world. The blessing doesn't just rest on Abram. And when God blesses us, it's not just for our own sake. There's something beyond that. God's grace comes to us, and it's a wonderful and awesome thing we sing about, and we talk about amazing grace, and it is amazing, but it doesn't just come to be grace collectors. God's people are to be grace dispensers. And so grace and blessing is always about responding in thanks and then seeking to be a blessing and a change. And that's why God called his people to seek justice, to care for the poor, to be people that would seek for the wholeness and the peace and the shalom of wherever they were. And we are to be people that receive the grace of God and then give it out like crazy. To be people of justice, generosity, mercy, humility, people like the Sermon on the Mount talks about with Jesus. In Hebrews 12:15, it says, see to it that no one misses the grace of God. See to it no one misses the grace of God. And then in 2 Corinthians, which is my favorite book of the Bible, a lot about weakness and God's strength. It says in the beginning, it says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, comma, not period, so that we can comfort those in trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. I hope in your life you can take stock and reflect on the ways that God has been good. And even if things are terrible, Jesus still died for you. But when we can look at those things, we should respond with gratitude, but then also find ways to return that to bless other people. That's God's call for Abram, was to be blessed so that he could be a blessing. It's no different for you and I. And we are called to be that in the world. And ultimately, God did bless the whole world through Abram, and he wants to continue doing that through us. So if you read the rest of Abram's story, there's actually several chapters that cover a lot of it. We're looking at just a few highlights of it. After Genesis 13, or Genesis 12, there's lots of stuff that happens with Lot, and they settle in the land, and Abram does some stuff that's really admirable, and some stuff that's really sketchy when they go down to Egypt. God tells him to land in the land, and the first thing he does is he goes to Egypt because there's a famine. There's all sorts of weird stuff he does. But then in Genesis 15, we have another theophany, another encounter between God and Abram, and here's what it says. It says, after this, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. He says, don't be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward. But Abram said, sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless? And the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, you've given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. Then the Lord came to him. The man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So here we have God creating a covenant. And after this, you can read, they have the ceremony where a covenant is affirmed with Abram. And Abram is given a new partnership with God. And he's even given a new name. His name Abram means, we're told later in 17, Abram means the father of glory. And Abraham means the father of a multitude. So he has a new calling. He has a new partnership. God tells him to walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant with you. He says, you'll have multiple offspring, like the stars in the sky. And this was fulfilled just later on in Egypt, after Joseph heads down that way. So God makes this promise to him, and it says, Abram believed God, and it was seen and credited to him as righteousness. This is the second major covenant we have in the Scriptures. Remember last week at the end of Noah's story, we were introduced to this idea of covenant, which is like partnership, God's agreement with human beings that he enters into on their behalf. It's his way of continuing to partner with people even though they are unworthy to be his partners. And Abram, not worthy to be called God's partner, and yet God chooses to. He blesses him and he works in and through him. And then through his offspring, God wants to bless all people. This is the birth of the nation of Israel, God's people. The Bible Project made a video that I thought is just really helpful, covering this theme of covenant. Last week we touched on it, and they explain it better than I can. So Gabe, can you roll that? It's just about 5 minutes.
If you've
really
been around
helpful.
Christians, you've probably heard of the idea of having a personal relationship with God, which could mean different things in the Bible, like having God as a friend, or your father, or maybe your teacher.
But there's one particular way that the Bible talks about this relationship that you find all over. But strangely, we don't talk about it that much. And that's the idea of a partnership with God.
A partnership like working alongside someone to accomplish a goal together.
Right, and this is actually what you see at the beginning of the Bible. God creates this good world full of all of this potential. And then God appoints these unique creatures, humans, as his partners in bringing more and more goodness out of all that potential.
But the humans don't want to partner with God. They rebel and try to create a world on their own terms.
And so this broken partnership is the Bible's explanation for why we're stuck in a world of corruption and injustice and the tragedy of death.
It's not like there's just one or two humans who have bailed on this relationship. In the story of the Bible, everyone has abandoned the partnership with God.
So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many, and he makes a new partnership with them called a covenant. And in a covenant, God makes promises, and then in exchange asks his partner to fulfill certain commitments. And the purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody else.
Now, there are actually 4 times in the Old Testament that we're told God initiates a covenant relationship with Noah, Abraham, the nation of Israel, and King David.
And it's through these that God is forming a covenant family into which all people will eventually be invited.
So let's see how these work. The first one is with Noah.
So in this story, God has just brought the flood to cleanse the world of humanity's corruption, and Noah and his family are the only ones left. And so God makes a covenant with Noah, saying, listen, I know that humans will continue to be evil, but despite that, I'm not going to destroy it like this again. Instead, the earth will be this reliable place for us to work together.
Great. So what does Noah have to do?
Nothing. And that's what's so interesting about this first covenant, is that God is promising to be faithful, even though he knows humans won't be.
The next time we see God make a covenant is with a man named Abraham. God chooses him, promises to bless him, give him a large family, lots of land where they can flourish.
And in return, God asks Abraham to trust him and train up his family to do what is right and just. And the whole reason for this covenant is God says that somehow he's going to bring his blessing to all families of the world through this one family.
So that's Abraham. The next time we see God make a covenant is when Abraham's family grows into the tribe of Israel.
And this covenant is with the whole tribe. God asks them to obey a set of laws, which are these guidelines for living well as a community of God's partners. And if they do this, then God promises to bless them and that they will become a people who then represent him to the rest of humanity.
That's the covenant with Israel. The last covenant is with King David.
Yeah, the tribe of Israel has become this large nation, ruled by David. And God asked David and his descendants to partner with him by leading Israel in obeying the laws and doing what is right and just. And God promises that one day, one of David's sons will come and extend God's kingdom of peace and blessing over all the nations.
So those are the 4 covenants that God makes in order to restore his partnership with the whole world.
But here's what happens. Israel breaks the covenant. They worship other gods, they allow horrible injustice, and so they lose their land and are forced off into exile.
So it seems hopeless. But during this time, Israel's prophets talked about a day when God would restore these covenants in spite of Israel's failure, somehow.
Yeah, they called it the New Covenant. And this is actually what's so interesting about Jesus, is that he's introduced into this story as the one who fulfills all of these covenant relationships. We're told that he's from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole world. We're told that he's the faithful Israelite who is able to truly obey the law. And we're told that he's the king from the line of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all.
And that's really remarkable for one guy.
Yeah, and what it highlights is perhaps the most surprising claim of all made about this man, that Jesus is no mere human, but rather God become human. And God did this in order to be that faithful covenant partner that we are all made to be, but have failed to be. And so through Jesus, God has opened up a way for anyone to be in a renewed partnership with him.
So Jesus calls people to follow him and become part of this new covenant family.
And despite their failures, Jesus is committed to making them into partners who are becoming more and more faithful.
The story of the Bible ends with a vision of a fully renewed world, full of goodness and peace.
And there's this renewed humanity there, partnering together with God to expand the goodness of his creation. And so the end of the Bible story is really a new beginning.
I think that's really cool. I find that to be really helpful. I've watched it several times, and each time I learn something new from it. But here we have this picture of what it meant for God to lay out covenants with people, to partner with them. And even though they fail over and over again, God remains faithful. And he makes a way, ultimately coming in Jesus to make everything right. Through the offspring of Abraham, the whole world is blessed. And not just through their actions, but really through through Jesus. God has made a way. He makes a way. And the same invitation to Abraham to be blessed, to be a blessing, to be God's partners is extended to us through Jesus. And Galatians 3:29 says, if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. That we become part of this covenant family. That we belong to that. We get that given to us. Maybe you sang this song growing up. Do you remember that song, Father Abraham had many sons and many sons? It's a pretty obnoxious song. Like, I don't know what it means. It's like right arm, left arm, like it. But it's probably going to be burned in your head all day now if you sang it growing up. And I never really understood what it means. But what it's trying to get at is like, God wanted to bless the world through Abraham. And because of Jesus, all of us get to be a part of that. We get to be a part of God restoring things from a place of brokenness. And the thing is remember, Abraham, he believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That like even in the book of Hebrews spends a lot of time unpacking this, that it is faith in God is how we stand with him, how we partner with him. See, we don't become heirs of God's family by working for him and earning our way in, but by being confident that God works for us and has done that in Jesus. And then responding in that way. And we can trust God to do the impossible, to take him at his word, which is what faith means, to believing what he says and then acting on that belief. Abram believed God that he would have a family even though he had no kids of his own. He believed God, and God said that's righteous. And so like Abram, like Desert Pete, we have the opportunity to choose our new inheritance from God by holding lightly the lives that we're giving and saying, no, I'm going to invest this instead into who God is. See, the story of Abram and the story of the Scriptures tell us that God does not give up on people. He doesn't give up on people, even though they make a mess of things. And God has not given up on you. He doesn't give up on you. He wants to be in a covenant and relationship with you. Pastor and author that I like to read named Rich Villodas, he says that the Bible is often summed up, a repeated story in 4 acts, or 4 elements of the story. It's the story that says, God says, I love you, I'm with you, do not be afraid, you can come home. I love you, I'm with you, don't be afraid, you can come home. That God does not give up on us. He makes a way for us to be with him. And so our thought for the drive home is this today, is God has demonstrated his commitment to us through Jesus in an even greater way than he did for Abraham. What is your response to that commitment? What is your response to the cross? What is your response to Jesus coming to fulfill all of the things that humans were unable to do, to make a way that you could be his people? You could come home to him. We can turn to him. What does trusting God look like? And so this morning, as is our custom on the first Sunday of every month, we are going to share in the Lord's Supper, communion, where you're going to hold a piece of unleavened bread and a cup, which remind us, which are the symbols of what Christ has done to establish a new partnership with you, a new relationship with you, a new way for you to be a new type of human. And so I'm going to invite the Horkeys to come forward, and then who's on my other? Oh, and the Batemans to come forward, and we're gonna participate in this together. This is for anyone who is a believer in Jesus. You're welcome to partake of this together. I'm going to pray in a moment here, and then after that, you can come down, and you'll be served, and you can bring your elements back to your seat, and we'll take those together. But as we do that, I want us just to reflect and pause for a moment and sit in the presence of God and acknowledge what he's done for us. Acknowledge what we're about to do. Let God examine us, and then we will celebrate this together. So just sit quietly, and then I'll pray, and then we'll call you forward.